We are on Daf Yudalid Amid Beis, about 2/3 down, and we're up to Vitizbara. So let's see if we can find the place on Daf Yudalid Amid Beis. You'll see on the right side of your page a Tosas Dibra Maskil Pshita, and if you count down a little bit below the word Pshita, maybe about 3-4 lines, you'll see a line that begins with the word Amrit. And if you take a beeline to the left, you'll see Vitizbara. So it's approximately, I'd say, 15 lines up from the bottom of page Yudalid Amid Beis. Vitizbara. The Gemara is saying that let's analyze the explanation that we offered as to why, in the case of Vadai, Rabbi Shimon said, Nimnu. Nimnu min avadai. Nimnu min avadai would mean that there would be no intermarriage between Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai in a case of Vadai. Like, for example, the case of Tzaras Erva, which is Vadai. However, in the case of Safek, Rabbi Shimon says, Lo nimnu. They weren't worried about. Like, for example, a man delivers a get to his wife, and then subsequently he spends time with her in an inn, in a fundak, in private, in yichud. And in such a case, you and I might have said, well, there's a very good chance that this man had in mind to remarry his ex-wife after Gerushin, and therefore she should not be allowed to marry anyone else without a get. That's a suffix situation. And in a suffix situation, Rabbi Shimon says, Lo nimnu, even though Beis Hillel would allow her, it was Beit Shammai who said will allow her to get married in such a case. And that's called suffix each. And Lo nimnu Beit Shammai mi lisa nashim mi Beis Hillel. So the Gemara says, wait a second, Nehi nami di asu, even if we accept the view, the more extreme view that Beit Shammai would go ahead and officiate, we'll use that word, officiate at a marriage between a Tzaras Erva and the Yavam, that's called asu, and they went ahead and implemented their psak. It was not theoretical, it was actual, which would mean that from the perspective of Beis Hillel, the child born from that marriage of a Tzaras Erva to a Yavam is a mamzer. Even if we assume asu, Bishleim, I understand Beis Hillel, nimnu mi Beit Shammai. And we have a vadai, which according to Reb Shimon means that Beis Hillel could not marry the offspring of Beit Shammai because they would never know in any particular case whether or not it was a marriage relationship between a Tzaras Erva and a Yavam, in which case the child is a mamzer. However, and that's because the Chayvei Krisis va'al v'umamzerim heim leBeis Hillel, because the child of such a marriage is a mamzer. It's a violation of the Chayvei Krisis, because since a Tzaras Erva does not fall for Yibam according to Beis Hillel, the relationship is an Erva of an Eishes. However, let's go in the opposite direction. I don't understand what Rabbi Shimon is saying when it goes from Beit Shammai to Beis Hillel. I understand very well why Beis Hillel would not want to marry into the families of Beit Shammai unless they knew for sure that there was no Tzaras Erva situation. But if there's a Tzaras Erva situation, they're dealing with mamzerus. But why would Beit Shammai be inhibited from marrying into Beis Hillel? Even in the worst case scenario, that Beis Hillel would allow a Tzaras Erva to get married to an Adam and each min hashuk without chalitza, so she didn't have chalitza, and according to Beis Hillel, she doesn't need chalitza, because the Tzaras Erva doesn't fall for Yibum, no need for chalitza. She went ahead and she got married to someone else. From Beit Shammai's perspective, the worst case scenario would be that she is now a Yevamot Ashuk, which violates a law of lo sucha alios lishacher. But the child of that relationship is not a mamzer because we're dealing with chayve lavin. There is no chiyuv kares in the case of a Yevamot Ashuk. And right now, we're not introducing Rabbi Akiva, who holds that yesh erva and yesh mamzerus b'chayve lavin. And if a man marries chayve lavin according to Rabbi Akiva, the Torah, the Allah, does not recognize the validity of that marriage, and the child of such a marriage is a mamzer. But we're not introducing Rabbi Akiva because the Chacham rejected Rabbi Akiva. So the Gemara answers by invoking Rav Nachman. Now let's just think about this. When you want to talk about Beit Shammai marrying someone from Beis Hillel, you can discuss it from two perspectives. You could talk about the vlad of a Yevamot Ashuk, or you could talk about the Yevamah herself, meaning, according to Beit Shammai, this woman, a tsaras erva, falls for Yibum. Beis Hillel is going to free her from any bonds of Yibum, any need for chalitza. Now you want to marry this woman. Now Beit Shammai has to address the question whether you're allowed to marry this woman. And obviously you're not allowed to marry this woman because she's Yevamot Ashuk l'shitas Beit Shammai. Says Rav Nachman, the Omer of Nachman, Bar Yitzchak, lo nitzcha el litzara atzma. The problem here that Beit Shammai is going to find is whether or not we allow the marriage. Can we officiate at a marriage between a disciple, a descendant of Beit Shammai, and a woman from the house of Beis Hillel? It's quite possible that in this case, she is a tsaras erva, and the Torah prohibits marrying her. So we can't allow one of the descendants of Beit Shammai who hold that a tsaras erva falls for Yibum and she needs chalitza to marry this woman because she is a tsaras erva that fell for chalitza, never got chalitza, she's a Yevamot Ashuk. Therefore, chinami lo nitzcha el tzara atzma. Now the Gemara wants to analyze Rabbi Shimon's inherent svara. What's the logic of Rabbi Shimon to differentiate between a vadai and a safek? And that was Rabbi Shimon's language, that nimnu min avadai velo nimnu min asafek. Maishna, the Gemara says naively, what's the difference between the two? Havadai, the isurahu. The reason why Beit Shammai would not marry from Beis Hillel in a case of a vadai is because it is isura. Or let's take it the other way around. Let's say Beis Hillel could not marry because of vadai, meaning Beis Hillel held that there was yichud and there was bia, and they know the most of bilos nus, and she needs a get, and she didn't get a get. So I understand very well why Beis Hillel have to worry about this situation. It's isura, or Beit Shammai having to worry about Beis Hillel in the case of tsaras erva, and all the different cases that we discussed yesterday. Safek nami, why not apply the same logic, the same principle to a case of safek isura? Let's say, for example, the case of a man who divorced his wife and then lona ima bifundiki, and we're afraid that maybe he had bia with her, and he made his bia into a bias kiddush and a bias ichus for the sake of marriage, and therefore, how can we allow her to marry someone else without a second get from her ex? That's a safek situation. Well, Beis Hillel are going to say, you can't marry this woman. She needs a get. Okay, I agree, it's a safek, but you're not allowed to marry a safek eishes ish. The Torah prohibits you from marrying a woman who needs a get mitzad safek, because safek doraisa lechumra. Now you're all familiar. I'm just going to remind you of the first Shev Shmaitita, where he discusses whether safek doraisa lechumra is doraisa or d'Rabbanan. This Gemara would seem to reflect the shita of those Rishonim that Safek Doraisa L'chumra is Doraisa, meaning that when the Torah prohibited X, it prohibited even in the case of Safek. And that's the Torah prohibition, which means that if the Torah says you can't marry an HSH, you can't marry a Safek HSH. So what's the difference here between Vadai and Safek? How could Rabbi Shimon justifiably make that distinction? The reason why you can't marry in the case of a Vadai is because of the Isur, and the same logic should apply even in the case of Safek, because Safek is also. Now, if you happen to have the Mesifta, then you'll take a look in footnote number Yud Zayin, and he says that Rishonim Pirshu B'Kush Sagmal Pidarkam Pirsh Vadei Safek Madulo Nimnu Milisa Afkashi Safek Im Nisarva Mi Mishpacha Zume Osan Shenechlaku Ba Beisil Beit Shammai Mi Safek Echad Neseres Kol HaMishpacha. So these Rishonim have a different perspective than Rashi on the Gemara's Kash. And here we get into a sugya which is called Yuchsin, which is called, has different names. It might be called Isa Salmona. The word Isa means dough, and it's used figuratively in Chazal for mixtures. An Isa means a mixture. It could be flour and water. It could be you added other fruit juices and sweeteners and whatever. But anyway, an Isa is a mishkababbled tarovis. Every family could potentially have a Safek Yuchsin. What does that mean? If we know for a fact that a Psul Yuchsin, a Psul Kol, got married into a family, and again, it could be that generations have gone by, and we cannot identify exactly where the Psul is. Where is she? Let's say she's a Mamzeres, and she married into a certain family. And the halacha is going to be Kol Kavua Kemechtzal Mechtzadam. The Safek is in a Makom Kvius, and this family, anytime I knock on a door of any member of that family, I might be greeted by someone who's Pasal Yuchsin, who might be a Mamzer, might be a descendant of a Mamzer or Mamzeres, and I have no way of knowing. That's called Safek. So the Gemara points out that if that is the case of Safek, let's say, for example, if we go with Beit Shammai, that a Tsaras Erva falls for Yibum, and therefore we're holding now Asu, Kidivreya, meaning Beit Shammai actually officiated at such a marriage. They encouraged a marriage between an Erva, a Tsaras Erva and a Yavam. And now a child is born from that relationship. That child, according to Beis Hillel, is a mamzer. The child who's a mamzer now marries into a family. Anytime anyone wants to marry into that family, again, if you belong to the school of Beis Hillel, it's going to be called kavua kemechtzal mechtzadam. You don't know, perhaps this is a descendant of that woman who was a Taras Erva, who fell for Yibum, according to Beit Shammai, and according to Beis Hillel is an Eishes Ach, if the Yibum is consummated. So that's what the Gemara has in mind by Safek. Safek is also awesome, because the halacha in Yuchsin is that once you have a psul and a mishpacha, until you clarify beyond the shadow of a doubt that this particular woman that you want to marry is not a descendant of that psul, you're not allowed to marry her. And that's called Safek, and it generates an Isa. That's a whole new perspective on this sugya. And by the way, you should know that this issue of psulim in a mishpacha has come up over and over again here in the modern state of Israel for the Rabbanut to make determinations about who's allowed to marry who to get what's called a heter nesuin. And there's a lot of backlash, of course, against the Rabbanut, because why are they taking their pretty time to give an ishur to allow so-and-so to marry so-and-so? And especially in the case of people who came from Chutz La'aretz, Russia, and other countries, you know, they check this and they check that. And the reason for that is because if they're psule mishpacha, it could be that in every situation you're going to have to paskin kol the parish meruba parish. I'm sorry, kol kavu k'metz al mechzin. On the side, again, anything I say now, I'm going to deny I said it. But Rav Shechter doesn't want to drink milk. You know about this? Because he thinks that in our day, again, you have to know more about the way they raise cows and so forth and so on. He says there are treifas mixed in there. There are cows that are definitely treif. And any milk that you produce might come from a cow that's treif, and a yotzim and also. And you're not allowed to drink that milk. Ella, what? You're going to say rov. And very often we rely on rov. Like mentioned Rabbi Tenla, all of a sudden, who just passed away a week ago, he would allow tuna fish, even though tuna fish is based on rov. You net in certain areas where most of the tuna fish are kosher. So he was lenient about that. So we do rely on rov and kashrus, and we have to. We can never be 100% sure in the massive kind of kashrus that goes on today. But Rav Shechter held that since they're milking the cows, then you have a whole group of cows lined up for milking purposes. You have to assume, based on the reality of today, that one of those cows, at least, is a treifa. And a lot of those who argue against Rav Shechter, they say, well, the Metzias hasn't changed. There was always a suffix cows, but we don't treat it as kavua. We treat it as called the parch, move parch. There are many, many issues here that have to be, I'm just simplifying. But in any event, the way the Rishonim are learning our sugya, Beis Hillel, who would claim that the Saras Erva marrying a Yavam is a krisus of Eishes Ach, the child of which is a mamzer. Now that child gets mixed up in a family. So now Beis Hillel wants to, they want to rule for any of those disciples of Beis Hillel to marry someone from Beis Shammai's household. There's a suffix of a psul kol in the family. So now the Gemara is looking for some justification of the distinction Reb Shimon makes here between suffix and van. The Gemara says, you know what? We're going to have to reinterpret Reb Shimon at this point. We're really at a standstill. Lo tema suffix. You got to change the text. You don't read it minas suffix. Because, as we said before, to the same extent that you have to be nimna, you have to avoid a vada, you have to avoid a suffix. So what do we do with the word suffix? The word suffix is very similar to the word stam. Well, it's not so similar, but anyway. Ela ema lo nimnu minas stam. That's how we're going to read it. What does that mean? That even though we're holding Beit Shammai asu kidivrehem, and as we said before, they went through with it. They recommended that the Tzaras Erva marry the Yavam. Nevertheless, they would notify Beis Hillel to avoid this particular family or this particular woman. And therefore, even if Beis Hillel want to worry and be concerned that maybe they didn't get the notification, it wasn't publicized on Facebook, so they didn't really know that this woman was a Tzaras Erva that married a Yavam. It's only a suffix. And in this situation of suffix, Beis Hillel can fall back securely and rely on the mechanism of Beis Shammai being modia, add that ayin at the end, of being modia Beis Hillel, stay away from this family because lishitascha, there's an erva here. And therefore, lo nimna min hastam, in a case where they didn't get a notification, and therefore a member of Beis Hillel doesn't know one way or the other. Is this woman a descendant of Itzaris Erva who married the Yavam, is she not? They didn't know. Lo nimnu min hastam. They fell back and relied on the assumption that Beit Shammai also kedivrayim, but they notified Beis Hillel in all cases. So now what's Vadai? Vadai is a cinch now. They would be Nimna with an I. Nimna min Vadai means that's a case where they got the notification from Beit Shammai, don't marry this family, this woman, because she is either herself a product of this marriage, of Croesus, of an Tzoros Erva, or she's the next generation from that Tzoros Erva situation. Now you might ask the following question. Certainly, if Beit Shammai notified Beis Hillel that his mamzerus here, no question about it, Beis Hillel could not marry into that family. Not only that, if your assumption is that whenever such an Erva situation arose and became a reality, like it's there was a notification from Beit Shammai to Beis Hillel, then certainly it makes sense to say that in the absence of notification, we assume the contrary, namely that there is no reason for a notification and there was no mixture of erva. So based on that, the Gemara says, Pshita, what did Rabbi Shimon add that I wouldn't have known on my own? It's intuitively undeniable that Beis Hillel would not marry a woman when Beit Shammai notified Beis Hillel that that woman is a Tzoros Erva, etc., etc. And it's also intuitively logical that since Beit Shammai would notify Beis Hillel in an event when there was a problem, that Beis Hillel would certainly, in a stomach situation, if they didn't hear one way or the other, they would have no compunctions or hesitations in going ahead with the marriage. So what exactly is the punchline here, the chiddush of Rabbi Shimon? And the answer really lies in the following realm. To what extent can we really rely on Beit Shammai to notify Beis Hillel? I mean, is that always the case? You know, there's so many complications and nuances, and there are generations to deal with. And then there are many people at Beis Hillel. Did they put it up on, on the internet? How would this? The engineering is very complicated, unless there's an absolute commitment. The Tzoros Erva was Misyabemes, and Beit Shammai at that moment in time are committed to set the record straight and communicate the situation to Beis Hillel. That's the Gemara's vacillation. Maiko mashmalon. So what is it that Reb Shimon is coming to teach us? The Ava v'Reis Noagim Zeb Hozeh. That there is a very strong motivation on the part of Beit Shammai, because of the Ava and Reis between Beit Shammai and Beis Hillel, to see to it that Beis Hillel clearly gets the message that there's smoke, and where's the smoke, there's fire, that there's a problem here of Erev. So the Gemara is not happy with that. Why? Hainu Reisha. Do you see those two words? Hainu Reisha. We go back to the Reisha of the Brisa. Forget about Reb Shimon. Even before Reb Shimon, it says in the Brisa, I quote, Lo nimnu Beit Shammai milisa noshim Beis Hillel, v'lo Beis Hillel mi Beit Shammai, l'landecha shechiba v'reus noagim zeh b'zeh l'kayim ha'shenemar ha'emes v'hashal me'ahavu. We see clearly, even before Reb Shimon, that in the light of emes v'shalom me'ahavu, there was reus and chiba that was tangible between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel in both directions, and therefore lo nimnu Beit Shammai milisa, etc. So what is Reb Shimon adding? Well, it says Hakamash Balon de Kula Reb Shimon. Your problem here is really a problem of editing, so to speak. There's no halachic issue here. There's no question of principle as to why Reb Shimon had to formulate something which we know already from the Brisa before Reb Shimon. And you want to come up with some sort of breakthrough, Salkedaitoch and Kamashma. No. That's irrelevant here. We have an issue of editing. And very often, when you edit a Mishnah or a Brisa, the opinion that's mentioned by name at the end of the Brisa is not a dissenting opinion, is not mentioned in order to add a whole new perspective of Chidush, but rather the author of the Brisa, and the way he edited the Brisa, and this can be true for Mishnah, leaves the name of the anonymous Tanakama for the end of the Mishnah. And this is a methodological style that was quite common at the time of the Shas, that you would mention a name at the end, which would reformulate and summarize in that statement exactly what we learned even before that name was mentioned in the anonymous ratio. So the Brisa adds the name Rabbi Shimon not to introduce a new concept, but rather to clarify and establish that everything that we've said until now was formulated and should be attributed to Rabbi Shimon. Now, going back again now to the issue of whether Beit Shammai asu k'divrayim or lo asu k'divrayim. Toshma. We want to prove from the following brisa that Beit Shammai asu k'divrayim. They followed through with it, and they would recommend a tzaras erva to be misyabenes. The Omar Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, heich halacha zu rovachas b'Yisrael. How do we publicize a halacha, a halachic ruling, in such a way that we can avoid any sort of pitfall, any sort of violation? He says the following: we need to find some common ground between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. But we, in the case of Torah 7, we seem to be in trouble. Nasa k'divrei Beit Shammai, if we're going to paskin and rule that a tzaras erev is misyabemes, like Beit Shammai, and the Mefarshim learned from this that at one time in history, they paskin like Beit Shammai. You know, we're post Edios. After the Mishnayos and Edios, we know that there are very rare exceptions to the rule that we always paskin like Beit Hillel. But that rule evolved with time. So back in the day, it was Gan Shayach that we would paskin like Beit Shammai. But then, if that's the way we're going to publicize it, then Avlad Mamzel Divrei Beit Hillel. We don't want to set up a situation where Beit Hillel, who holds no mitzvah yibum, would be stuck with an erva in which a man has a relation with Eshes Ach and is mamzerus. So it's very nice to be machmir like Beit Shammai and send out the word that there is a mitzvah of yibum here. Don't think you're exempt from yibum just because you're a tzara of an erva. But on the other hand, what about Beit Hillel? Now you're creating mamzerus. So let's send out the word nasa k'divrei Beit Hillel. We should allow this woman, this tzaras erva, to get married to anyone without yibum, without chalitza. Chas v'sholom, we can't allow yibum because she's an Eshes Ach. There is no mitzvah of yibum. Well, you've got your problem here as well. Why? Because Havlad Pogum L'Divrei Beit Shammai. Now, either it was yesterday or I don't remember anymore, maybe it was 2 days ago, I took a shot at this possibility, and I'm hoping that you'll agree that now I could prove that what I said was not so far from the mark. Meaning, if Beis Hillel will allow a tzaras erev to get married to the chuk without any chalitza, then Beit Shammai have a problem. Even though, again, we're dealing with chayvei lavim, there's no hafkas issues, and there's no mamzerus, but avlad pogum. And what I tried to present, based on a Gemara in Ksubis, in the first parak, there's a concept called Maila Asu B'Yuchsin, that with regard to kahuna, we raise the ante. And we demand a yuchsin of the highest level, pure, unadulterated miyuchasin for the Kohanim. In fact, the Mishnah in Ksubas talks about the ksuba that's offered in a case of a Kohen that marries a Bas Kohen. You up the ante on the ksuba. We really, again, I don't want to use the word pedigree because it sounds like, we're insulting the rank and file citizen. But when it comes to kahuna, we're very, very careful. And we want to make sure that the genealogy and the mishpachos of kahuna are on the up and up. They're all tahoros without any exception. And we have a halacha called pagu, of Vlad Pagu, where the yuchsin are not 100%. So, for example, I shouldn't say this. You know what? At this point, I'm going to just